The crystal chandelier cast dancing shadows across the mahogany conference table as I watched my son Richard adjust his expensive Rolex. His voice carried that condescending tone I'd grown to despise over the past months. "Mother, at 81, you simply can't be trusted with this kind of financial responsibility anymore." 23 pairs of eyes turned toward me in the boardroom of Whitmore Associates, the same firm where my late husband had built his empire from nothing. The leather chairs creaked as board members shifted uncomfortably, their faces a mixture of pity and anticipation. I kept my hands steady on the polished wood, watching my son's theatrical performance. "This is for your own protection, Margaret," he continued, his voice dripping with false concern. "The doctors have expressed serious concerns about your cognitive decline." I smiled at Richard, my eyes never leaving his face. After 57 years of marriage to his father and 38 years of watching him grow from an ambitious young man into something I barely recognized, I'd been waiting for him to finally show his true colors in public. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. But to understand what happened in that boardroom, you'd need to know what I discovered 3 weeks earlier. The morning fog was just lifting off Lake Champlain when my granddaughter Emma knocked on my kitchen door. At 28, she had inherited her grandfather's keen intelligence and her grandmother's stubborn streak, though she'd never admit to the latter. She worked as a forensic accountant in Burlington, specializing in elder financial abuse cases, which made her visit that Tuesday morning particularly unsettling. "Grandma Maggie," she said, not quite meeting my eyes as she accepted the cup of Earl Grey I offered, "I need to talk to you about something serious." Through the bay window of my Victorian home, I could see the gardens that Robert and I had cultivated over 4 decades of marriage. The roses were past their peak now, but the late-blooming chrysanthemums added splashes of gold and burgundy to the carefully planned landscape. Robert had always said a garden was like a good investment, requiring patience, wisdom, and the ability to see beyond the current season. "What's troubling you, dear?" I asked, settling into the chair across from her at the breakfast nook. Emma's fingers drummed against the delicate china cup, a nervous habit she'd had since childhood. "It's about Dad," she began carefully. "Some things I've noticed lately about your finances, about how he's been handling your affairs since Grandpa died." Robert had been gone for 18 months now, a stroke while reading the morning paper in his study, quick and merciful as he would have wanted. But his absence left a void that went beyond companionship. For 30 years, he'd managed Thornfield Industries, the manufacturing company we'd built together from a small machine shop into a regional powerhouse. When he died, the company's value had been assessed at just over $12 million, with additional assets including our historic home, investment portfolios, and real estate holdings bringing our total worth to nearly $15 million. "What kind of things?" I asked, though something cold was already settling in my stomach. Emma pulled out her phone and showed me a series of screenshots. "I've been keeping an eye on the company's public filings, just to make sure everything was running smoothly after Grandpa's death. But there are some transactions that don't make sense." I studied the screen, recognizing the corporate letterhead but not understanding the financial jargon. Robert had always handled the business side while I managed our home and the charitable foundation we'd established. It had been a partnership that worked beautifully for decades, but now I realized how vulnerable that division of labor had left me. "This shows a transfer of $2 million from the company's reserve fund to something called RWT Holdings," Emma explained. "And this one shows another $1 million going to Pinnacle Consulting Services. Both transactions were authorized by Dad as the new CEO, but I can't find any record of what these companies actually do." RWT Holdings. Richard William Thornfield Holdings. Even I could figure out that connection. "When did these transfers happen?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt inside. "The first one was 6 weeks after Grandpa's funeral. The second was just last month." "Grandma, that's $3 million. That's essentially vanished from the company accounts." I set down my teacup with deliberate care. In the garden, a cardinal landed on the birdbath Robert had installed near my favorite rose bush, bright red against the fading green of autumn, bold and unmistakable. "Emma," I said slowly, "I think you'd better tell me everything you suspect." What she told me over the next hour made my blood run colder than the October morning air. Richard had been systematically transferring company funds to shell companies he controlled. He'd convinced the board that I was no longer mentally capable of understanding complex business decisions, painting a picture of a grieving widow whose judgment couldn't be trusted. He'd hired a management consulting firm, staffed entirely by his business school friends, to recommend restructuring that would essentially strip me of any real authority over the company Robert and I had built together. "But Grandma," Emma said, her voice tight with anger, "he's not just stealing from the company. I think he's planning something much bigger. I've been watching the real estate transactions in town, and there's a pattern. Someone's been buying up properties around the historic district, paying well over market value. And guess who's been facilitating those sales as a consultant? The historic district. Our neighborhood, where Robert and I had spent 42 years turning a rundown Victorian mansion into a showcase of period restoration. Where we'd raised Richard and his sister Catherine. Where we'd hosted charity galas and business dinners. Where Robert had proposed to me in the gazebo we'd built overlooking the lake. He wouldn't dare," I whispered, but even as I said it, I knew that the son I'd raised would absolutely dare. Emma pulled out more documents, printouts she'd clearly prepared carefully. "Grandma, I think he's positioning to have you declared incompetent. Look at this." She showed me correspondence between Richard and Dr. Harrison, the physician who'd been treating our family for 15 years. The letters discussed my increasing confusion and memory lapses, my inability to handle complex decisions, and recommendations for cognitive testing that I'd never agreed to undergo. "I've never had any memory problems," I said, more to myself than to Emma. "Dr. Harrison has never expressed any concerns about my mental state." Emma nodded grimly. "That's what I thought. So I did a little investigating. Turns out Dr. Harrison's practice recently received a very generous donation to their new wing construction. Care to guess who made that donation? The cardinal had been joined by his mate at the bird bath. They moved around each other in a careful dance, each taking turns drinking while the other kept watch. Robert used to say that cardinals mated for life, that they were symbols of enduring love and loyalty. Qualities, apparently, that weren't inherited by all offspring. "Emma," I said carefully, "I need you to help me understand something. If Richard succeeds in having me declared incompetent, what happens to everything Robert and I built?" Her answer was exactly what I'd feared. "He becomes your guardian with complete control over all your assets, the house, the company, everything. And guardianship cases are incredibly difficult to reverse once they're established." I stood up from the table and walked to the window, looking out at the gardens that would soon be dormant for winter. But dormant wasn't dead. Underground, the bulbs we'd planted were already preparing for spring, gathering strength in the...
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Darkness, ready to burst forth when conditions were right. "How long do we have?" I asked. "Based on what I've seen, I'd guess he's planning to file the competency petition within the next few weeks. He's been building his case carefully, documenting instances of supposed confusion, getting medical opinions, creating a paper trail that would support his claims." Emma joined me at the window. "But Grandma, there's something else. Something I discovered yesterday that changes everything." She pulled out one final document, this one from the Vermont Secretary of State's office. RWT Holdings isn't just stealing money from Thornfield Industries. It's been purchasing mineral rights all around Lake Champlain. Apparently, there's been some geological surveying suggesting possible valuable mineral deposits in this area. If someone controlled enough of the mineral rights, and if they could acquire the surface properties at reasonable prices, they could make millions. I finished. Emma nodded. Tens of millions, possibly. And the best way to acquire those surface properties would be to have inside information about families who might be vulnerable to pressure to sell quickly. Families like the Hendersons, whose patriarch had died last spring, leaving his widow struggling with medical bills. Like the Pattersons, whose son had been pressuring them to sell their lakefront cottage and move into assisted living. Like me, supposedly a confused widow who couldn't be trusted to make her own decisions. "Emma," I said, turning back to face her, "I need you to promise me something. Whatever happens over the next few weeks, whatever your father tries to do, I need you to trust that I know exactly what I'm doing." She studied my face, and I saw some of Robert's steel in her dark eyes. "What are you planning, Grandma?" I walked over to Robert's old roll-top desk in the corner of the kitchen, the one where he'd handled personal correspondence for decades. From the bottom drawer, I pulled out a leather portfolio that hadn't been opened since his funeral. Inside were documents that Richard had never seen, preparations that Robert had made in the final months of his life when he'd sensed his time was growing short. "Your grandfather was many things, Emma, but naive wasn't one of them. He knew that his death would create opportunities for people to take advantage, and he took steps to protect what we'd built together." I opened the portfolio and showed her the first document. "This is a copy of my medical records from Johns Hopkins, where I underwent comprehensive neurological testing 6 months ago at Robert's insistence. Perfect cognitive function, no signs of dementia or Alzheimer's, results that would stand up in any court." Emma's eyebrows rose as she scanned the medical report. "Dad doesn't know about this?" "Your father knows only what I've chosen to tell him, which, lately, hasn't been very much." I showed her the second document. "And this is a power of attorney that your grandfather and I executed, giving me sole authority over all our assets in the event of his death, with very specific instructions about who can and cannot challenge those decisions." The third document made Emma smile for the first time that morning. "This is a trust agreement establishing the Thornfield Family Heritage Trust. Everything we own, the house, the company, our investments, all of it goes into an irrevocable trust designed to preserve the family legacy. And the successor trustee, in the event of my death or incapacity, isn't your father." "It's me," Emma said softly, reading the carefully typed pages. "Grandma, when did you and Grandpa do this?" 3 months before he died. He'd been watching Richard's behavior, seeing how his values had changed since business school, how he'd started viewing everything in terms of profit margins instead of family legacy. Robert was disappointed, but he wasn't surprised. I took the documents back and returned them to the portfolio. "Your grandfather always said that the best way to deal with a wolf was to let it think it was hunting sheep right up until the moment you revealed your fangs." Emma laughed, a sound that reminded me of Catherine when she was that age. "So what do you need me to do?" Over the next 2 hours, we planned my counterattack with the precision of a military campaign. Emma would continue monitoring Richard's financial activities, documenting every questionable transaction, every instance of self-dealing, every step in his apparent plan to defraud both me and the company. She would also begin reaching out to other property owners around the lake, warning them about potential scams, and encouraging them to seek independent legal advice before making any major decisions. Meanwhile, I would begin what Emma called building my competency file. I would schedule my own cognitive evaluation with a neurologist in Boston, someone with no connection to Dr. Harrison or our local medical community. I would document my daily activities, my management of household affairs, my continued involvement in charitable work and community activities. Most importantly, I would begin gathering evidence of Richard's fraud in a way that he would never suspect. "The key," Emma explained, "is that we need him to commit fully to his plan before we reveal what we know. If he suspects we're onto him, he'll back off and try a different approach. But if he thinks he's successfully fooled everyone, he'll get overconfident and make mistakes." That afternoon, after Emma had gone back to Burlington, I sat in Robert's study, surrounded by photo albums and scrapbooks documenting our life together. Our wedding day in 1965, both of us young and eager, and completely unprepared for what lay ahead. The early years when we'd lived in a tiny apartment above the machine shop, working 18-hour days to build something that would last. Richard's birth in 1968, followed by Catherine 2 years later. The children's school plays and soccer games, family vacations to the mountains, quiet evenings reading by the fireplace. When had Richard changed? When had the bright, ambitious boy who used to help his father in the shop on weekends become someone who could look at his widowed mother and see only an obstacle to profit? I thought about the conversation I'd overheard at Catherine's wedding 5 years ago, when Richard had been discussing real estate investments with some college friends. Even then, there had been something cold in his calculations, a willingness to see people as commodities rather than individuals with their own hopes and dreams. But dwelling on disappointment wouldn't solve anything. Robert used to say that you couldn't change the cards you were dealt, only how you played them. And I'd been dealt some very good cards indeed, starting with a granddaughter who combined professional expertise with fierce family loyalty, and a legal framework that would protect everything Robert and I had built together. That evening, I called Catherine in Seattle. My daughter had followed her artistic dreams to the Pacific Northwest, where she taught art therapy and lived in blissful ignorance of her brother's business schemes. "Mom," she said, her voice warm with affection, "how are you holding up? I know the holidays are going to be difficult this year." "I'm managing just fine, sweetheart. But I do have a favor to ask." I explained that I was considering some changes to my financial arrangements, updating documents and reviewing investment strategies. Nothing unusual for a recent widow, but I wanted her to know that she might be getting some calls from lawyers or financial advisors in the coming weeks. "Is Richard helping you with all this?" she asked. "I know he's been worried about you managing everything alone." Richard had been worried, all right, but not about my well-being. "Your brother has been very attentive," I said carefully. "But I want to make sure I understand all my options before making any major decisions." We talked for another half hour about her work, her latest art projects, her plans to visit for Christmas. Catherine lived in her own world of creativity and compassion, trusting that the people she loved would always do right by each other. It was a beautiful way to live, but it left her vulnerable to those who operated by different rules. After hanging up, I made one more call, to an old friend whose advice I'd always valued. Judge Patricia Morrison had retired from the bench 3 years earlier, but her legal mind remained as sharp as ever. We'd served together on various charitable boards over the years, and she'd been one of the few people who truly understood the partnership Robert and I had shared. "Maggie," she said after I'd explained my situation, "I'm not surprised. I've seen too many cases like this. Adult children who view their aging parents as inconveniences to be managed, rather than people to be respected." She paused, and I could hear her flipping through what sounded like legal references. "But you've got advantages that most victims don't have. Resources, documentation, and, most importantly, advance warning about what's coming." She recommended a law firm in Montpelier that specialized in elder law and estate planning, attorneys who would understand the nuances of competency challenges and asset protection. "The key is to establish your mental capacity beyond any reasonable doubt before Richard makes his move. Once a competency petition is filed, you're playing defense. Much better to control the narrative from the beginning." That night, I sat on the screened porch Robert had built during our 3rd year in the house, listening to the sounds of the lake settling into evening quiet. Loons called across the water, their voices carrying the wildness that had first drawn us to this place. Robert used to say that loons were survivors, birds that had remained essentially unchanged for millions of years because they'd learned to adapt without compromising what made them essentially themselves. It was a lesson I intended to apply in the coming battle with my son. I would adapt my tactics to meet his challenge, but I wouldn't compromise the values that Robert and I had shared for more than half a century. Integrity, loyalty, and the belief that some things were more important than money. Over the next week, I began implementing the strategy Emma and I had developed. I scheduled the neurological evaluation in Boston, telling my regular physician that I wanted a comprehensive assessment for my own peace of mind following Robert's death. I began keeping a detailed journal of my daily activities, documenting meetings with financial advisors, charitable work, household management, social activities that demonstrated continued mental acuity and independence. Most importantly, I began what I privately called Operation Honeypot. I started leaving carefully crafted pieces of information where Richard would find them during his increasingly frequent visits to check on my well-being. Bills that suggested I was confused about household finances. Notes to myself about forgetting appointments or misplacing important documents. Medical reminders that hinted at health concerns I'd never actually discussed with any doctor. The performance required delicate balance. I needed to appear vulnerable enough to encourage Richard's plans, while not seeming so impaired that he would rush his timeline. He had to believe he was in complete control, that his elderly mother was playing right into his hands. "You're enjoying this entirely too much," Emma observed during one of our weekly planning sessions. She'd driven down from Burlington with updates on Richard's financial activities, including evidence that RWT Holdings had accelerated its mineral rights acquisitions and begun preliminary negotiations with several lakefront property owners. "Your grandfather always said that if you had to fight a battle, you might as well enjoy winning it," I replied, showing her the latest addition to my evidence file. Richard had brought his lawyer, David Moss, to the house the previous day, ostensibly to review some routine estate documents. But I'd noticed how Moss had studied my behavior, asking leading questions about my daily routine, my ability to handle complex tasks, whether I'd been experiencing any confusion or memory lapses lately. "He's building his case," Emma agreed, reviewing the notes I'd taken immediately after their visit. "But so are we. The neurologist's report came back perfect, your competency file is rock solid, and we've documented every questionable transaction Richard has made in the past 6 months." I walked over to the kitchen window, where I could see Richard's BMW pulling into the driveway. Right on schedule for our weekly lunch, during which he would subtly probe for signs of mental decline while positioning himself as the devoted son trying to protect his vulnerable mother. "Emma, I think it's time for the final phase of our plan." She looked up from the financial documents spread across the kitchen table. "You're going to confront him?" "Not exactly. I'm going to let him confront me. Your father has been building towards something, and I think he's finally ready to make his move. When he does, I want to be prepared with everything I need to not just defend myself, but to turn the tables completely." That afternoon's lunch with Richard followed the pattern that had developed over recent weeks. He brought expensive takeout from a restaurant in town, commented on how well I was managing on my own, then gradually steered the conversation toward concerns about my ability to handle various responsibilities. Today's focus was on the upcoming board meeting for Thornfield Industries, scheduled for the following week. "Mother, I've been thinking about the quarterly meeting," he began, picking at his salmon salad with the careful attention of someone whose mind was clearly elsewhere. "Given everything that's happened since Dad's death, all the changes and adjustments, maybe it would be better if you let me handle the presentation to the board." I set down my fork and looked at him with what I hoped appeared to be confused concern. "Handle the presentation? But Robert always expected me to update the board on foundation activities and community relations. It's been my responsibility for 20 years. Richard's smile had the practiced patience of someone dealing with a difficult child. "I know, and you've done a wonderful job. But these meetings have become so complex, so many financial details and regulatory issues. I just thought it might be easier for everyone if I took over those duties." "Easier for everyone," I repeated slowly. "Richard, are you saying you don't think I'm capable of speaking to our own board of directors?" His answer revealed everything I needed to know about his state of mind. "Of course not, Mother. But you've been under tremendous stress since Dad died, and some of the board members have expressed concerns about whether you're ready for such a demanding role." Board members expressing concerns. That was new information. And deeply troubling. Richard had clearly been working behind the scenes for months, poisoning relationships I'd cultivated for decades, setting the stage for what was coming next. "What kind of concerns?" I asked, letting my voice carry just a hint of the confusion he expected to hear. Richard leaned forward, his expression radiating false compassion. "Just concerns about your well-being, about whether you've been feeling overwhelmed by all the decisions you've had to make lately." I let silence stretch between us while I appeared to consider his words. Outside the dining room window, I could see the gardens Robert and I had planned together, now dormant but not dead, waiting for spring to reveal the strength they'd been building through the cold months. "Perhaps you're right," I said finally. "Perhaps it would be better if you handled the more complex aspects of the business." Richard's relief was palpable. "I think that's very wise, Mother. And actually, there's something else I wanted to discuss with you. I've been talking to Dr. Harrison about your health, about how you've been coping with the stress of Dad's death. Here it came. The trap Richard thought he was setting for me, not realizing he was walking into one I'd prepared with far more care and patience than he'd ever demonstrated. Dr. Harrison has been very helpful, I said neutrally. He has, and he suggested that it might be beneficial for you to undergo some cognitive testing, just to establish a baseline for your health going forward. Nothing invasive, just some routine assessments to make sure you're not developing any issues that could affect your judgment or decision-making ability. I allowed my expression to shift from confusion to something that might have been fear. Cognitive testing? Richard, is there something wrong with me that you're not telling me? His hand covered mine across the table, warm and dry and completely without the comfort he was pretending to offer. There's nothing wrong with you, Mother. This is just preventative care, making sure we catch any potential problems early. And if these tests showed problems? I asked softly. What would happen then? Richard's pause told me everything. He'd rehearsed this conversation, planned every word, every gesture designed to manipulate me into compliance. Then we'd make sure you got the help you needed. Professional management for your finances, assistance with daily tasks, whatever support would keep you safe and comfortable. Professional management for my finances. The euphemism was almost insulting in its transparency. I nodded slowly, as if considering his proposal. I suppose if Dr. Harrison thinks it's necessary, I think it's the responsible thing to do, for both of us. After Richard left, I called Emma immediately. It's happening, I told her. He's ready to make his move. I need you to accelerate our timeline. Within hours, Emma had set in motion the final phase of our counterattack. She scheduled an emergency meeting with the law firm in Montpelier for the following morning. She compiled our complete evidence file, documenting every fraudulent transaction, every instance of self-dealing, every step in Richard's plan to steal both my assets and my autonomy. Most importantly, she arranged for what we'd privately termed insurance. If Richard thought he could manipulate the legal system to his advantage, he was about to learn that two could play that game. But unlike him, we'd made sure we were playing with a full deck. That evening, I sat in Robert's study, surrounded by the books and papers and photographs that documented a life well lived. Tomorrow, I would begin the fight for everything we'd built together. But tonight, I allowed myself a moment of quiet grief for the son I'd lost somewhere along the way. The boy who'd once helped his father in the machine shop and dreamed of building something lasting and good. The phone rang just after 9 o'clock. Richard's voice carried an urgency I hadn't heard before. Mother, I need to see you first thing tomorrow morning. There's been a development with the company, some issues that need immediate attention. What kind of issues? I asked, though I suspected I already knew. Financial irregularities that the auditors have discovered. Nothing that can't be resolved, but I need your signature on some documents to authorize the necessary corrections. Financial irregularities, documents requiring my signature. The acceleration of his timeline meant something had spooked him, forced him to move faster than he'd originally planned. Of course, dear. What time should we meet? Early. Say 8 o'clock? I'll bring everything we need to review. After hanging up, I made one final call to Judge Morrison. Patricia, I think tomorrow is the day. Richard's moving faster than we expected, which means he's either gotten nervous about something or he's received pressure from his co-conspirators. Are you ready? She asked. As ready as I can be. The lawyers have everything they need. Emma has documented the fraud thoroughly, and I have 40 years of community respect to draw upon. But Patricia, if this goes wrong... It won't go wrong, Maggie. You've prepared too well and you have something Richard doesn't understand. You have people who genuinely care about you, not what you can do for them. I spent one last evening in the home Robert and I had shared, walking through rooms filled with memories of a marriage that had weathered every storm, because it was built on mutual respect and genuine partnership. Tomorrow, I would find out whether the son we'd raised together had retained any of those values, or whether greed had consumed whatever goodness we'd tried to instill in him. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed midnight, and I realized that technically, tomorrow had already arrived. In just 8 hours, Richard would knock on my front door expecting to find a confused, frightened old woman ready to sign away her independence and her legacy. Instead, he would discover that some battles are won before they're ever fought, by people patient enough to let their opponents defeat themselves. The morning sun streamed through the lace curtains of my breakfast nook as I prepared for what would either be Richard's greatest triumph or his complete downfall. I had been awake since 4, not from anxiety but from the peculiar energy that comes when months of careful planning are about to bear fruit. The coffee was strong, the way Robert had always liked it, and I found myself speaking to his photograph on the mantelpiece as I went through my final preparations. "Well, old man, today we find out what kind of son we really raised," I murmured, adjusting the small recording device Emma had given me. It was barely larger than a button, sophisticated enough to capture clear audio from across a room, and completely legal in Vermont, as long as one party to the conversation knew about it. That party would be me. At exactly 8 o'clock, Richard's BMW crunched up the gravel driveway. Through the window, I watched him retrieve a leather briefcase from the back seat, checking his watch with the impatience of a man who believed his time was more valuable than anyone else's. He wasn't alone. David Moss emerged from the passenger side, carrying his own briefcase and wearing the kind of expensive suit that small-town lawyers wore when they wanted to appear more successful than they actually were. I opened the front door before they could knock, greeting them with the slightly bewildered smile I'd been perfecting for weeks. "Richard, Mr. Moss, you're right on time. I have fresh coffee if you'd like some." Richard kissed my cheek with his usual perfunctory affection. "That would be wonderful, Mother. I'm afraid we have quite a bit to discuss this morning." As I busied myself in the kitchen, I could hear them arranging papers on the dining room table, speaking in the hushed tones of conspirators who believed their victim was too addled to understand what was happening. When I returned with the coffee service, a complete china set that had been a wedding gift from Robert's mother, they had transformed my dining room into a makeshift law office. "Mrs. Thornfield," David Moss began, his voice carrying the practiced concern of someone who made his living manipulating elderly clients. "Richard has explained the situation with the company's financial irregularities. I know this must be very stressful for you." I set down his coffee cup with hands that trembled just slightly. "I'm afraid I don't understand much about business matters. Robert always handled those things." Richard leaned forward, his expression radiating false sympathy. "That's exactly why we need to act quickly, Mother. The auditors have discovered some discrepancies in the company accounts, problems that could result in serious legal issues if they're not corrected immediately." Discrepancies. The euphemism was almost amusing, given that he was the one who had created them. "What kind of legal issues?" I asked, allowing my voice to carry the slight quaver of a frightened elderly woman. Moss opened his briefcase and withdrew a stack of documents thick enough to choke a horse, the kind that could result in criminal charges if the proper corrections aren't made. But fortunately, Richard has found a way to resolve everything quickly and quietly. I studied the papers he spread before me, recognizing some legal terminology but pretending confusion about the rest. "There are so many pages," I said helplessly. "I don't understand what most of this means." Richard's hand covered mine across the table. "You don't need to understand it all, Mother. That's why you have me to help you. These documents will transfer temporary management authority to me while the auditors complete their investigation." Temporary management authority. Another euphemism. What the documents actually contained, according to the analysis Emma and I had conducted with our own attorneys, was a complete transfer of all my assets and decision-making authority to Richard, with no mechanism for reversal and no expiration date. If I signed these papers, I would become a ward of my own son, dependent on his goodwill for everything from my living arrangements to my grocery money. "And this will solve the problems with the company?" I asked, reaching for the pen Moss had placed temptingly near the signature lines. "Completely," Richard assured me. "Once I have the authority to make the necessary corrections, everything will be resolved within a few days." I paused with the pen halfway to the first signature line. "But what about Emma? She works with financial matters. Shouldn't we ask her opinion?" The glance that passed between Richard and Moss was brief but telling. They discussed my granddaughter, probably at length, and concluded she was either too young to be taken seriously or too removed from the situation to interfere effectively. Emma means well, Richard said carefully, but she doesn't understand the complexities of running a manufacturing company. This requires someone with real business experience. Someone with real business experience. As opposed to a forensic accountant who specialized in exactly the kind of fraud he was attempting. I nodded slowly, as if accepting his assessment. I suppose you're right. You've always been so much smarter about these things than the rest of us. Richard's smile was triumphant. He thought he'd won, that his confused old mother was about to hand him everything she and Robert had spent a lifetime building. There is one thing, I said, setting the pen down again. I'd feel more comfortable if Dr. Harrison could examine these documents, just to make sure I understand what I'm agreeing to. You know how he worries about me making important decisions when I'm under stress. The suggestion clearly frustrated both men, but they couldn't object without seeming unreasonable. Of course, Moss said smoothly. But Mrs. Thornfield, time is really of the essence here. Every day we delay increases the risk of serious legal complications. I picked up my phone with fingers that shook just enough to suggest anxiety. Let me call his office and see if he can see me this morning. The conversation with Dr. Harrison's receptionist was brief and, from Richard's perspective, disappointing. The doctor was in surgery all morning and couldn't see me until the following afternoon. Mother, Richard said, his patience clearly wearing thin, surely you trust me enough to proceed without involving Dr. Harrison. This is exactly the kind of situation where you need to rely on family. Trust him. The irony was so complete it was almost beautiful. Of course I trust you, dear. But this is such an important decision. What if I wait until tomorrow, get Dr. Harrison's blessing, and then sign everything? Would that be acceptable? Another glance between Richard and Moss, this one longer and more pointed. Whatever timeline they were working under, it apparently didn't allow for 24-hour delays. Actually, Moss said, there's another option we should consider. Given the urgency of the situation and your understandable anxiety about making such important decisions, perhaps we should proceed with the competency evaluation Richard mentioned. There it was. The trap they thought they were springing, not realizing they were walking into one I'd prepared, with far more care than they'd invested in their scheme. Competency evaluation? I repeated, allowing confusion and fear to color my voice. Richard moved his chair closer to mine, his hand settling on my shoulder with what was probably meant to be reassurance. It's nothing to worry about, Mother. Just some simple tests to confirm that you're mentally capable of making these kinds of decisions. Once that's documented, no one can ever question whether you understood what you were signing. But what if the tests show that I'm not capable? I asked, the question every elderly person feared, but few were willing to voice. Moss leaned forward with predatory interest. Then we'd make sure you got the care and protection you needed. Richard would be appointed as your guardian, with full authority to manage your affairs and make decisions in your best interest. Full authority to manage my affairs. The euphemisms were getting thinner, the true nature of their plan becoming more obvious with every exchange. And if I refuse to take these tests? I asked softly. Why would you refuse? Richard's voice carried a harder edge now. Unless you have something to hide, unless you're not as mentally competent as you claim to be. The implication was clear. Refusing the evaluation would be taken as evidence of impaired judgment, possibly even used against me in a competency proceeding. I stood slowly, walking to the window that overlooked the gardens Robert and I had planted together. The chrysanthemums were past their peak now, but the structure of the garden remained strong, ready to burst into life again when spring arrived. I suppose if you both think it's necessary. I do, Richard said firmly. And Mother, I've already made arrangements with Dr. Morrison at the medical center. He can see you this afternoon if you're willing. This afternoon? No time to prepare? No opportunity to seek independent counsel? No chance for Emma to interfere with their carefully orchestrated plan. It was a masterpiece of manipulation, really, if you could admire such things in the abstract. Dr. Morrison, I repeated. Not Dr. Harrison? Richard's expression didn't change, but I caught the slight tightening around his eyes. Dr. Harrison doesn't specialize in cognitive assessment. Dr. Morrison is the expert in these matters. Dr. Morrison was also the expert Richard had been cultivating for months, the one whose practice had received that generous donation, the one who could be counted on to find exactly the level of cognitive impairment that would justify a guardianship petition. "I see," I said quietly. I returned to my chair, picking up the pen again and staring at the signature lines that would sign away everything Robert and I had built together. Richard and Moss watched me with the intensity of hawks circling prey, convinced that victory was within their grasp. "Actually," I said, setting the pen down with finality, "I think I'd like to call Emma before I make any decisions. She should know what's happening." Richard's mask of patience finally began to slip. "Mother, Emma doesn't need to be involved in this. It would only upset her unnecessarily." "Upset her unnecessarily," I repeated. "Or upset your plans unnecessarily?" The question hung in the air like smoke, changing the entire atmosphere of the room. Richard's expression shifted from false concern to something much more calculating. "I'm not sure what you're implying," he said carefully. I smiled at my son, the expression carrying none of the confusion or fear I'd been projecting for weeks. "I'm not implying anything, Richard. I'm stating it directly. You've been stealing from the company, manipulating my medical records, and planning to have me declared incompetent so you can steal everything your father and I spent our lives building." The silence that followed was profound. Moss began gathering his papers with hands that weren't quite steady. Richard stared at me as if seeing a stranger. "Mother, you're obviously confused. The stress of Dad's death has affected your judgment more than I realized." "Has it?" I reached into the drawer of the sideboard behind me, withdrawing the leather portfolio that contained the documents Robert had prepared in the final months of his life. "Then perhaps you can explain these financial records showing the transfer of $3 million from company accounts to shell companies you control." I spread the documents across the table, watching Richard's face go pale as he recognized bank statements, corporate filings, and transfer authorizations that he'd thought were safely hidden. "Or perhaps you can explain why you've been telling people that I'm mentally incompetent, while simultaneously relying on my supposed incompetence to authorize these fraudulent transactions." Moss was on his feet now, his briefcase snapped shut. "Mrs. Thornfield, I think there's been a misunderstanding. Perhaps we should reschedule this meeting when you've had time to calm down." "Sit down, Mr. Moss," I said, my voice carrying an authority that made him freeze halfway to the door. "We're not finished here." I pulled out my phone and pressed a single button. Within seconds, Emma's voice filled the room through the speaker. "Grandma, are they there?" "They're here, dear. Both of them." Emma's professional voice took on a harder edge. "Mr. Moss, this is Emma Thornfield, licensed forensic accountant for the state of Vermont. I want you to know that every word of this conversation is being recorded, and that I have in my possession evidence of massive financial fraud involving RWT Holdings, Pinnacle Consulting Services, and the systematic theft of assets from Thornfield Industries." Richard found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "You can't prove anything." Emma's laugh was cold. "Actually, Dad, I can prove everything. Bank records, property transfers, mineral rights acquisitions, bribes to medical professionals, conspiracy to commit elder fraud. I've been documenting your activities for months." I ended the call and looked at my son with something approaching pity. "Richard, did you really think you could steal millions of dollars from a company your father built and not leave a paper trail? Did you honestly believe you could manipulate an old woman who helped create that company from nothing?" He was staring at me as if I'd become someone he didn't recognize. In a way, I suppose I had. For months, I'd played the role of a confused, vulnerable widow. Now I was simply being myself, a woman who had helped build a multi-million-dollar company and wasn't about to let anyone, including her own son, destroy it. "The cognitive evaluation you're so eager for me to take?" I continued, reaching for another document from the portfolio. "I took one 3 weeks ago, administered by the neurological department at Massachusetts General Hospital. Perfect score. Fully competent to make my own decisions and manage my own affairs." The document landed on the table between us with definitive finality. Richard's eyes scanned the official letterhead, the detailed assessment. the conclusion that could not be challenged by any court in the country. "You've been planning this," he said, his voice hollow with disbelief. "For months," I confirmed. "Did you think your father would leave me defenseless against exactly the kind of person you've become? Did you imagine that 40 years of marriage to one of the shrewdest businessmen in Vermont wouldn't teach me something about protecting what's mine?" Moss had resumed his seat, but his hands were shaking as he tried to reorganize his papers. "Mrs. Thornfield, I want you to understand that I was acting on information provided by your son. If there have been any misrepresentations—" "Save it," I said curtly. "I know exactly what role you've played in this scheme, including your arrangement with Dr. Morrison and your preparation of fraudulent competency documents. Emma has copies of everything." I walked to the window again, looking out at the lake where loons called across the morning's stillness. Robert used to say that loons were survivors because they never forgot who they really were, no matter what circumstances they faced. "Richard," I said without turning around, "I want you to understand something very clearly. You are no longer welcome in this house. You are no longer employed by Thornfield Industries. And you are no longer my son in any way that matters." The words hit him like physical blows. "Mother, you can't mean that. I'm your family. I'm all you have left." I turned to face him, and he must have seen something in my expression that finally made him understand the magnitude of his miscalculation. "I have Emma. I have friends who actually care about my well-being rather than my bank account. And I have the memory of a husband who would be ashamed of what you've become." "But the company," he stammered. "Everything Dad built. Everything we worked for together." The presumption in that statement, the assumption that he had somehow earned a share in what Robert and I had created, was perhaps the most revealing thing he'd said all morning. "The company will survive," I said calmly, "under new management, with a board of directors that understands the difference between stewardship and theft." I returned to the table and began gathering the fraudulent documents they'd brought. "These papers you wanted me to sign? They're evidence now. Emma has already provided copies to the district attorney's office." The color drained from Richard's face completely. "The district attorney? Financial fraud in excess of $1 million is a felony, Richard. Elder abuse is a federal crime. Conspiracy to commit both is something the state of Vermont takes very seriously indeed." Moss was frantically stuffing papers into his briefcase. "I need to make some phone calls," he muttered. "This situation requires immediate legal consultation." "Yes, it does," I agreed. "I'd recommend you find lawyers who specialize in criminal defense. You're both going to need them." As they prepared to leave, Richard made one last attempt to salvage something from the wreckage of his scheme. "Mother, please, we can work this out. I can return the money, dissolve the shell companies, make everything right. No one has to know what happened here." I looked at my son, this man I'd raised from infancy, whose scraped knees I'd bandaged and whose dreams I'd encouraged, and felt nothing but profound sadness for what he'd chosen to become. "Richard, everyone already knows what happened here. The board members, you thought you'd convinced that I was incompetent? They've been briefed by Emma and our attorneys. The investors you brought in for your development scheme? They've been informed that the mineral rights you promised them are worthless because the properties will never be available for development." "The properties," he said weakly. "But the geological surveys, the mineral deposits, are completely fictional." I finished. "Created by a geological consulting firm that exists only on paper, funded by money you stole from your father's company, designed to lure investors into a development scheme that was fraudulent from the beginning." The full scope of his defeat was finally sinking in. Not only had his plan to steal my assets failed, but the secondary scheme to defraud investors had been exposed as well. He was facing not just family disgrace, but serious prison time. "Emma will be here within the hour," I continued, glancing at my watch, "along with representatives from the district attorney's office and the FBI's financial crimes unit. If you want to be anywhere else when that happens, I'd suggest you leave now." They left in silence, their earlier confidence replaced by the desperate urgency of people who suddenly understood they were in serious trouble. I watched from the window as Richard's BMW disappeared down the driveway, probably for the last time. Part of me, the part that remembered the bright, ambitious boy he'd once been, felt genuine grief for what he'd thrown away. But a larger part, the part that had spent months enduring his condescension and manipulation, felt profound satisfaction at having turned his own tactics against him so completely. Emma arrived 30 minutes later, followed by a convoy of official vehicles that transformed my quiet lakefront property into something resembling a crime scene. Special Agent Patricia Wolfe from the FBI's White-Collar Crime Division was a woman about my age, with steel gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. She conducted her interview in my living room, treating me with the respect of one professional to another, rather than the patronizing concern I'd endured from my son for months. "Mrs. Thornfield," she said after reviewing the evidence file Emma had compiled, "I have to say, this is one of the most thorough financial fraud cases I've seen in 20 years of federal service. Your documentation is exceptional." "I had an exceptional teacher," I replied, nodding toward Emma, who was coordinating with the state investigators in the dining room. "Your son made several serious mistakes," Agent Wolfe continued, "but the biggest was underestimating you. Everything we've seen suggests he genuinely believed you were a confused elderly woman who couldn't understand what was happening to her." "That was the role I needed him to believe in," I said. "Robert always taught me that the best way to defeat an enemy was to let them defeat themselves through overconfidence." "The investigation would take months to complete," Agent Wolfe explained, "but the evidence was so comprehensive that plea bargains were almost inevitable. Richard and his co-conspirators were looking at federal prison time, restitution payments that would bankrupt them, and professional disgrace that would follow them for the rest of their lives." "What about the other families around the lake?" I asked. "The ones he was targeting for his development scheme?" Emma looked up from her coordination with the state investigators. "We've contacted everyone we could identify. Most of them are grateful for the warning. The Hendersons are considering filing their own elder abuse charges against Richard for the pressure he put on Mrs. Henderson after her husband died." As the official vehicles began leaving in the late afternoon, taking boxes of evidence, and recorded statements that would ultimately destroy my son's life, I found myself alone in the house Robert and I had shared for so many years. The silence felt different now, not lonely but peaceful, the quiet of a battle won and a home secured. I walked through the rooms slowly, touching furniture we'd chosen together, looking at photographs that documented a life well lived, and a love that had endured every challenge except death itself. In Robert's study, I sat at his desk and pulled out the fountain pen he'd used for important correspondence, the one he'd inherited from his own father. The letter I wrote was brief but comprehensive, informing the board of Thornfield Industries that Richard Thornfield had been terminated for cause, and that new leadership would be announced within the week. Emma had already agreed to serve as interim CEO while we identified a permanent replacement, someone who understood that a company's value couldn't be measured solely in profit margins. I also wrote to Catherine, explaining what had happened with her brother and assuring her that her inheritance remained secure. My daughter's artistic heart would be devastated by Richard's choices, but she deserved to hear the truth from me, rather than reading it in the newspapers when the indictments were unsealed. That evening, I sat on the screened porch Robert had built during our 3rd year in the house, listening to the loon's call across the darkening lake. The sound carried the wildness that had first drawn us to this place, the promise that some things endured beyond human schemes and ambitions. Emma joined me as the stars began appearing over the water, carrying 2 glasses of wine and the quiet satisfaction of someone who had just completed a job exceptionally well. "Grandma," she said, settling into the chair beside mine, "I have to ask, when did you first suspect what Dad was planning?" I sipped the wine, a bottle from Robert's carefully maintained cellar, and considered her question. "I think part of me always knew," I said finally. "Your grandfather used to say that people revealed their true character under pressure, and Richard had been showing us his character for years. The business school arrogance, the dismissive attitude toward anyone he considered less successful, the way he talked about profit as if it were the only thing that mattered." "But you gave him every opportunity to prove you wrong," Emma observed. "Even after you knew what he was planning, you left openings for him to reconsider, to choose family over greed." "That was true," Even knowing what Richard intended, I'd hoped until the very end that some spark of the boy I'd raised might reassert itself. That hope had died this morning when he'd looked at my confusion and fear and felt only satisfaction at how well his manipulation was working. "Your grandfather left me more than just legal protections," I told Emma. "He left me the knowledge that some battles are worth fighting, no matter how much they hurt. This house, this company, everything we built together, it represents more than just financial assets. It represents a way of life, a set of values, a commitment to building something that lasts." Emma reached over and took my hand. "It's safe now. Everything Grandpa worked for, everything you've protected, it's all safe." I squeezed her fingers, feeling the strength of another generation, another guardian for the legacy Robert and I had created. "It's more than safe, dear. It's in the hands of someone who understands what it really means." The loons called again across the dark water, their voices carrying the ancient promise that some things endure, that survival belongs to those who remember who they really are, no matter what storms they weather. I raised my glass to the empty chair beside me, the one where Robert used to sit on evenings like this, and whispered the words he would have understood. "We did it, old man. Our legacy is secure." The wine was excellent, aged to perfection in the cellar Robert had so carefully maintained. Some things, I reflected, only got better with time and patience. Like justice. Like the satisfaction of knowing that greed and manipulation, no matter how carefully planned, could never defeat the power of love and determination working together. Tomorrow, the newspapers would carry the story of the financial fraud that had been uncovered at Thornfield Industries. Richard's name would be associated with words like embezzlement and elder abuse, terms that would follow him for the rest of his life. But tonight, in the home I'd helped build and successfully defended, surrounded by the memories of a marriage that had weathered every storm, I allowed myself the quiet satisfaction of a battle well fought and decisively won. The lake settled into nighttime stillness, and I settled into the peace of knowing that some things, the things that really mattered, were worth fighting for no matter what the cost. 3 months later, I stood in the boardroom of Thornfield Industries for the first time since that fateful morning when Richard had tried to manipulate me into signing away everything Robert and I had built. The mahogany table gleamed under the crystal chandelier, and the familiar faces of board members who had known me for decades looked back with expressions of respect, rather than the pity I'd seen in their eyes during Richard's campaign of deception. Emma sat to my right, no longer the concerned granddaughter who had warned me of danger, but the newly appointed permanent CEO of the company her grandfather had founded. At 28, she was young for such a responsibility, but her combination of financial expertise and genuine understanding of Robert's values made her the natural choice to lead Thornfield Industries into its next chapter. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said, rising from my chair at the head of the table, "when my husband Robert founded this company 30 years ago, he had a vision that went beyond mere profit margins. He believed that a successful business should strengthen the community it served, provide meaningful work for its employees, and create value that would endure for generations." The quarterly reports spread before us told a remarkable story. Despite the turmoil of Richard's fraud and the legal proceedings that followed, Thornfield Industries had not only survived but thrived under Emma's leadership. New contracts with environmentally conscious manufacturers had more than offset the revenue from clients who had been uncomfortable with the criminal investigations. Employee morale, which had suffered under Richard's cost-cutting measures, had rebounded dramatically when workers learned that their jobs were secure and their contributions valued. "The Thornfield Family Heritage Trust," I continued, "ensures that this company will never again be vulnerable to the kind of schemes that my son attempted. Our commitment to ethical business practices, fair wages, and community investment is now legally protected in perpetuity." Board member Harold Peterson, who had known Robert since their college days, nodded approvingly. "Margaret, I have to say, the way you handled that situation was masterful. Richard had most of us convinced that you were no longer capable of understanding complex business decisions." His comment drew chuckles from around the table, but I detected genuine admiration in their voices. "Richard understood one thing correctly," I replied. "At 81, I don't have the energy or inclination to manage day-to-day operations. But he fundamentally misunderstood what that meant. Age doesn't diminish wisdom, and experience doesn't become worthless simply because it comes with gray hair. Emma stood to present the financial projections for the coming year, her confidence and competence evident in every word. Watching her command the room with such natural authority, I felt the deep satisfaction that comes from knowing that everything Robert and I had worked to build was in capable hands. The company would continue to grow and prosper, but it would do so while honoring the values that had made it successful in the first place. After the meeting, Emma and I drove through downtown Burlington, past the construction site where Richard's fraudulent development project had been planned. The lot stood empty now, its for sale sign a reminder of dreams built on deception. The legitimate developers who had been approached about the property had withdrawn their interest once the mineral rights fraud was exposed, leaving Richard's co-conspirators with nothing but worthless contracts and legal bills they couldn't afford. "Have you heard anything about the sentencing hearing?" Emma asked as we stopped at a traffic light. Richard's trial had concluded 2 weeks earlier with guilty pleas on all counts. Federal sentencing guidelines suggested he would spend at least 8 years in prison, followed by supervised probation and restitution payments that would consume any assets he might ever acquire. "Judge Morrison called yesterday," I said, watching pedestrians cross the street with the purposeful energy of people who had places to go and meaningful work to do. "Richard's lawyer is requesting leniency based on his lack of prior criminal history and his supposed remorse for what he did." Emma's expression hardened. "Remorse? He showed no remorse when he was trying to have you declared incompetent. He showed no remorse when he was stealing millions from the company." She had a point. Even after his arrest, Richard had continued to maintain that he was protecting me from my own poor judgment, that his actions had been motivated by concern for my welfare rather than personal greed. "The judge will make her decision based on the evidence and the law," I said. Our role was to ensure that justice had all the information it needed. What happens next is beyond our control. We drove in comfortable silence through neighborhoods where Robert and I had once looked for our first home together, past the elementary school Richard and Catherine had attended, through the historic district where we'd eventually built our life together. The familiar landmarks triggered memories of happier times, when Richard had been a bright, eager boy who helped his father in the workshop and dreamed of making his mark on the world. The tragedy wasn't that he had failed to achieve his ambitions, but that somewhere along the way, he had lost sight of the difference between success and mere acquisition. Robert had always said that the measure of a person wasn't how much they accumulated, but how much they contributed to the lives of others. That evening, I sat in my study reading letters that had arrived throughout the week from friends, neighbors, and business associates who had learned about Richard's crimes through newspaper coverage of the trial. The responses fell into predictable categories: expressions of sympathy for what I'd endured, admiration for how I'd handled the situation, and promises of continued friendship and support. But one letter was different. It came from Sarah Patterson, whose elderly parents had been among the families Richard had targeted for his development scheme. Her father had died 6 months earlier, and Richard had approached the family about selling their lakefront cottage at a time when grief had made them vulnerable to pressure and manipulation. "Mrs. Thornfield," she had written, "I want you to know that your granddaughter's warning probably saved our family from making a terrible mistake. Mom was so overwhelmed after Dad's death that she was ready to sign anything that promised to simplify her situation. Learning about your son's fraud helped us understand that the generous offer for our property was actually an attempt to steal something that has been in our family for 3 generations. The letter went on to describe how the Patterson family had decided to keep their cottage, converting it into a memorial retreat where families dealing with loss could find peace and healing by the lake. They had named it the Robert Thornfield Memorial Retreat, honoring not just my husband's memory, but his belief that property should serve the community, rather than simply enriching its owners. I set the letter aside and walked to the window that overlooked the lake. The autumn colors had reached their peak, painting the shoreline in shades of gold and crimson that took my breath away, even after 40 years of witnessing this annual transformation. Robert used to say that fall was nature's way of showing us that endings could be beautiful, that letting go of one phase of life simply made room for whatever came next. The phone rang, interrupting my meditation on seasonal transitions. Catherine's voice carried the warmth that distance and time had somehow failed to diminish. "Mom, I wanted to check on you before the sentencing hearing tomorrow. Are you doing okay with all of this?" My daughter had taken the news of her brother's crimes hard, struggling to reconcile the man who had attempted to defraud me with the brother she remembered from childhood. "I keep thinking about the time he broke my bicycle and then helped me fix it," she had told me during one of our long phone conversations. "Or when he taught me to drive stick shift because Dad was too nervous to do it himself. When did that person disappear?" "I'm doing fine, sweetheart," I assured her. "Tomorrow will bring closure to this chapter, and then we can focus on moving forward." Catherine had offered to fly in from Seattle for the sentencing hearing, but I'd discouraged her from making the trip. There was nothing she could do to change the outcome, and I saw no reason for her to witness her brother's final humiliation in person. "Have you thought about what you'll say if the judge asks for a victim impact statement?" she asked. The prosecutor had mentioned that opportunity, the chance for me to address the court about how Richard's crimes had affected my life and my family. "I've thought about it," I said, settling into Robert's favorite chair. "But I'm not sure there's anything I need to say that hasn't already been said by the evidence and the testimony." Catherine was quiet for a moment. "Mom, you have every right to be angry about what Richard tried to do. You don't have to be gracious about this." She was right, of course. I did have every right to anger, to the satisfaction of seeing someone who had betrayed my trust face the consequences of their choices. But anger, I'd learned over 8 decades of life, was a luxury that ultimately cost more than it was worth. "Your brother made his choices," I told her. "Now he has to live with the consequences. My energy is better, spent on protecting what we've built and ensuring that it continues to serve the purposes your father and I intended." After we hung up, I spent the evening going through photo albums that chronicled our family's history. Pictures of Richard as a toddler, learning to walk in the garden behind our first apartment. School plays and graduation ceremonies, family vacations and holiday celebrations, all the moments that had seemed so important at the time. The tragedy wasn't that these memories were false, but that they represented a path not taken, a version of Richard that had existed but had been abandoned in favor of something smaller and meaner. The boy who had once helped elderly neighbors with their groceries had grown into a man who saw elderly people as obstacles to his financial ambitions. The next morning dawned clear and cold, with the kind of brilliant October sky that made everything seem possible. Emma picked me up at 9 o'clock for the drive to the courthouse, both of us dressed in the conservative business attire appropriate for such a solemn occasion. "Are you nervous?" she asked as we navigated the morning traffic in Montpelier. "Not nervous," I replied, watching the familiar landmarks pass by. "Sad, maybe. Ready for this to be finished, certainly. But not nervous." The courthouse was crowded with reporters, lawyers, and curious observers, drawn by the unusual nature of the case. Financial fraud was common enough, but cases involving family members attempting to defraud their elderly parents always attracted additional attention. We made our way through the crowd with the assistance of Special Agent Wolf, who had remained involved throughout the legal proceedings. Inside the courtroom, Richard sat at the defendant's table with his lawyer, wearing the kind of expensive suit that had once been his uniform, but now seemed like a costume from another life. He looked older than his 55 years, his face drawn with stress and the weight of knowing that his life as he had known it was over. When he glanced back and saw me in the gallery, our eyes met for a brief moment. I tried to find some trace of the boy I had raised, some flicker of remorse or recognition of what he had thrown away, but his expression remained closed, defensive, the face of someone who still believed he was the victim of circumstances beyond his control. Judge Patricia Morrison, my old friend from various charitable boards, presided with the dignity and authority that had made her one of Vermont's most respected jurists. She had recused herself from any personal involvement in the case, but her reputation for fairness and wisdom made her presence both appropriate and comforting. The sentencing hearing proceeded with the formal ritual of justice, prosecutors and defense attorneys making their final arguments about punishment and redemption, about deterrence and the possibility of rehabilitation. Richard's lawyer painted a picture of a man who had lost his way after his father's death, whose poor judgment had been compounded by grief and financial pressure. The prosecutor presented a different narrative, describing a calculated scheme to defraud not only his own mother, but also vulnerable families throughout the community, a pattern of behavior that showed complete disregard for the welfare of others. When Judge Morrison asked if I wished to make a victim impact statement, I stood slowly, feeling the weight of 8 decades, and the responsibility of speaking not just for myself, but for all the elderly people who had been or might be victimized by similar schemes. Your Honor, I began, my voice carrying clearly through the silent courtroom, my son's crimes have caused damage that goes beyond financial loss. They have shaken my faith in family bonds, forced me to question memories I had treasured, and reminded me how vulnerable age can make us to those who would exploit our trust. I paused, looking directly at Richard, hoping that something in my words might reach whatever remained of his conscience. But they have also reminded me of the strength that comes from unity, from friends and family members who stand with us when we need them most. My granddaughter Emma, the attorneys who helped protect my interests, the law enforcement officers who took these crimes seriously, all of them represent the best of what we can be when we choose to support rather than exploit each other. Judge Morrison nodded, her expression reflecting the gravity of the situation. Mrs. Thornfield, is there anything specific you would like the court to consider in determining an appropriate sentence? I had thought carefully about this moment, about what justice meant in the context of family betrayal and violated trust. I would like the court to consider that my son's crimes were not impulsive mistakes but calculated schemes that took months to plan and execute. They were not crimes of passion but crimes of greed, carried out against someone who had loved and trusted him unconditionally. The courtroom remained silent, as Judge Morrison reviewed the sentencing guidelines and considered the arguments that had been presented. When she finally spoke, her words carried the authority of law, but also the wisdom of someone who understood the human cost of the crimes being punished. Mr. Thornfield, she said, addressing Richard directly, you have pled guilty to federal crimes that strike at the heart of family relationships and community trust. Your actions represent a profound betrayal of the woman who gave you life and the man who taught you the values you chose to abandon. Richard's lawyer had requested a sentence of 2 years, arguing for leniency based on his client's lack of prior criminal history and his supposed cooperation with the investigation. The prosecution had requested the maximum sentence of 12 years, citing the sophisticated nature of the fraud and the vulnerability of its primary victim. Judge Morrison sentenced Richard to 10 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised probation and full restitution to all victims of his schemes. It was a sentence that balanced justice with mercy, acknowledging both the severity of his crimes and the possibility of eventual redemption. As the court officers led Richard away to begin serving his sentence, he looked back one final time. This time, I thought I saw something different in his expression, perhaps the beginning of understanding about what he had lost and what he had done to lose it. Outside the courthouse, Emma and I stood in the autumn sunshine, breathing deeply of air that seemed cleaner somehow, lighter, with the weight of justice finally rendered. It's over, Emma said simply. Finally. It's really over. I nodded, but my thoughts were already turning toward the future, toward the work that remained to be done in protecting other families from similar betrayals. No, dear, I said, taking her arm as we walked toward our car. Now it begins. Now we make sure that what we've learned makes a difference for others who might find themselves in similar situations. The drive home took us past the lake that had been the centerpiece of Robert's and my life together, past the gardens that would sleep through winter and bloom again in spring, past the community that had rallied around us when we needed support and would continue to benefit from the values we had fought to preserve. Richard's schemes had failed, but their failure had revealed something more valuable than any financial gain he might have achieved. It had shown us the power of preparation, the importance of community, and the enduring strength that comes from knowing who you are and what you stand for, regardless of the challenges you face. That evening, as I sat on the porch where Robert and I had shared so many quiet conversations about our hopes and dreams, I raised a glass of wine to his memory and to the future we had secured together. The lake reflected the setting sun like a mirror, perfect and peaceful and eternal. Tomorrow, Emma and I would begin the work of establishing a foundation to help other elderly people protect themselves from financial exploitation. We would share our story, not as victims who had suffered, but as survivors who had prevailed through careful preparation and unwavering determination. Some battles, I reflected, are worth fighting not just for what they protect, but for what they prove about the enduring power of love over greed, wisdom over deception, and family bonds that transcend the betrayal of any one individual. The loons called across the darkening water, and their voices carried the promise that some things endure forever. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.